Welcome back, everybody. This is Tabby from Modern Life Podcast. You can find all our episodes on modernlifepodcast.com. You can email us modernlifepod@gmail.com. And you can find us on Instagram and Twitter @modernlifepod. Today we're going to be talking about Animal Farm by George Orwell. And I have a really exciting guest today, Marie from the Buchstaeblich podcast. You can also find her on Instagram at My Colorful Bookshelf. I'll have everything linked below. On her Buchstäblich podcast, Marie discusses literary works, how literature is still relevant today, and how it impacts our lives. It's a beautiful German language podcast. That's also really nice if you want to just learn German and just listen to analyses of your favorite books. Let's get into it. Welcome back. I have Marie here with me from the Buchstäblich podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited to be on your podcast finally. And we're talking about a great book, so I'm very excited to do that.
So glad we could make it happen. But before we get into that, what is your modern thought? What's your interesting fact for us today?
Yeah, it's more of a interesting thought process and not a fact, I think. But I came across this essay by Roxane Gay called Not Here to Make Friends. And it was basically about the likability of characters and how a lot of people link unlikable characters to bad writing. And I thought that was very interesting because I have never done that personally. I always was a very big fan of unlikable characters because I think a lot of unlikable characters seem more human because they're flawed and not all perfect and don't always make the right decisions. But she said that she's come across a lot of bad reviews on her books, for example, where people said they didn't like it because they didn't like the main character, for example. And I thought there was just a very interesting thought. And
I didn't know that was happening. I find that a very, very immature, almost like very poor reading comprehension. I didn't know that that was a thing that people were so judgmental of.
Yeah, it was very new for me, but it really got me thinking. And then I realized that I've had several conversations about Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games. And in those conversations, some people said that they think they would have enjoyed the books more if she had been more likable. And that was a very weird thing to me because I think she's a beautifully written character because she's flawed and because she's not all perfect. But apparently that's a thing.
I'm surprised people don't like Katniss Everdeen. She's so strong.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's a lot about expectations we have. I guess there's also a big difference between male and female characters there because...
I was just about to ask you that. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess we just expect a female character to be very loving and warm, and Katniss isn't really that warm. She's very cold and calculating, I think. But I think that's actually a very interesting trait that I really enjoyed. So I thought it was very interesting that so many people didn't like her, and that so many people apparently link the unlikability of characters to the quality of the book.
Yeah, that is interesting. That's a really good one. And also, if I think about any kind of classic lit, there's so many characters who, I mean, you wouldn't say you like Rodya in Crime and Punishment. He's a literal criminal, or, you know, any of these like Russian authors or people I can think of.
Yes, I immediately thought of Dorian Gray. I think it really discusses a lot of very interesting topics, but Dorian Gray isn't a likable character, right? I mean, he basically secludes himself from all of his friends, he abandons everything and everyone, and he kills people, he's very self-absorbed. I wouldn't want to be his friend. But I've never heard anyone link that to the quality of the book. So I think that's very interesting.
Good one. So mine is actually book related as well. It's from an article by CNBC, And it's saying that physical books are actually outselling ebooks, which I wasn't aware of at all. I thought it would be the other way around, just because ebooks are so much more accessible. You can read them on the go. I think they're also a lot more friendly towards any kind of disability because you can set your fonts and the color. And it's actually young people who are kind of promoting this buying of actual physical books, which makes sense to me if I look at something like the Bookstagram community online where people, just love to show off, myself included, all the beautiful editions and books that are coming out. So yeah, books are still outselling ebooks, which makes sense also in a world where we are so visual. I think it's more interesting to have a photo of some leather-bound tome than your e-reader.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. And most of the people I know read far more physical books than ebooks. But it's still a little surprising because, as you said, e-readers and ebooks do have a lot of pros to them. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I thought it would be balanced, maybe.
Yeah, I think I would have thought the same. But yeah, that's all we have. We can dive into the main topic. Animal Farm came out in 1945 by George Orwell. Are you ready to do the summary of the book?
Yeah, sure. We start off with this old pig, Old Major, and he tells all of the other animals of the farm about his dream. And he basically dreams of this animal rebellion, and he wants the animals to be independent and live in peace together, basically. And the farmer of these animals, Mr. Jones, actually also treats them really badly, and he's a drunk, so the whole situation isn't great for the animals, so they decide to actually take action and take over the farm. And there are these two pigs organizing the whole thing, Napoleon and Snowball, and they also give this whole movement the name Animalism, which is of course an allegory to communism, but I think we'll get into that a little later. And they formulate 7 commandments, and they're basically all about you shouldn't act like a human being, and all animals are equal. But Mr. Jones doesn't give up, and he wants to win the farm back. So there is the Battle of the Cowshed, which the animals are able to win, actually. And then there is this rivalry between Snowball and Napoleon, because they both want to be the official leaders of the farm. And Snowball actually proposes the building of a windmill, which would provide them with electricity. So he's very clever and has this very thought-through plans. But Napoleon obviously wants to win and only has his interests in mind. So he expels Snowball from the farm and makes him the scapegoat for everything bad that happens from there on. And there's a lot of bad things happening on the farm. And then there's actually another attack by another farmer called Frederick. He basically did a trade with the farm, but then gave them fake money, and they're all very angry at each other. But the animals can defeat the human beings again, but the most hardworking horse, Boxer, is very badly injured in this battle, and then Napoleon realizes he won't be able to work anymore, and he sends him to slaughter, which is, in my opinion, the most heartbreaking part of the whole book. And yeah, some of the animals kind of, at that point, notice that something's off, that not everything is great that's going on, but they can't really do anything about it. And the pigs seclude themselves, they live in the farmer's house, they wear clothes and drink alcohol and walk on 2 legs, and basically do all of the things that they agreed on not doing when they formulated those commandments, and they then also just change the commandments so that they're not doing anything wrong, and they make the animals believe that it's always been like that. So the most well-known quote from the whole book is probably, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others," which is what they change the 7th commandment to. And it's really, really heartbreaking to see. And yeah, the book ends with the pigs reconnecting with farmers, with humans, and having some kind of party or meeting or a mixture of both, where they want to, decide on the future of the farm and work together. And the other animals watch from the outside, and they can't tell the pigs and the humans apart anymore.
Very well done. That's a great summary. Yeah, I just want to...
Thanks.
What you just said, that last line, I love so much. The creatures outside looked from pig to man, from man to pig, and from pig to man again, but already it was impossible to say which was which is a great last line.
I think so too. It's really scary though, when you think about it.
Yes, yeah.
How there's this huge development, and then in the end we're basically at a point that's even worse than at the beginning.
Yeah, I think it is worse. I think you're right about that. Because at least they were all, in the beginning, kind of oppressed together. And now they're just so split apart.
Yeah, and also this whole development, there were a lot of sacrifices made for the sake of animalism. And then in the end, nothing changes. So all of these animals were killed or died for nothing, basically.
All of the things that these animals represent. I mean, the story is written like a fairy tale. That's the point of the book. So it's very easy to read. But it wasn't a quick read for me, even though it is such a small book, because I would read one sentence and then spend another 5 minutes on Wikipedia, looking up what does this actually mean and trying to familiarize myself with Russian history.
Yeah, definitely. It's such a small book. It's under 100 pages, I think. But there's so much to it, and it has so much meaning, which I think is amazing, but also I think can be quite difficult when you want to understand all of that. So I've already said that with animalism, this whole movement being an allegory for communism, and the whole story basically retelling the Russian Revolution. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So should we go into the different characters?
Let's do it. We're starting off with Old Major, right? That was the original pig.
Yeah.
Which I believe is supposed to be Lenin.
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of Marx and Lenin.
Ah, okay.
If you view it from just the Russian perspective, it would be Lenin, I think. But if you have a bit more of a broader view, I guess you could also say he's a symbol for Marx.
Yeah, the ideology and the whole theme of it. The interesting thing about Napoleon is such a great choice for a name.
I think so too, because it connects so many more things and it gives even more depth to the whole story, because obviously Napoleon represents Stalin in the Russian Revolution, but calling him Napoleon also includes a lot more history, basically, coming from France. So I think, it's definitely an amazing choice. We all know the name Napoleon, so we all associate things with it. And
that's true. Yeah, it's a good literary device.
So I'm sure he was aware of that when deciding how to name the characters.
And then Snowball is Trotsky, I have written down here.
Yeah.
Leon Trotsky, who he always wants rebellion on all other farms, whereas Napoleon is for the socialism in one country. So their goals in the book represent the different takes on socialism and how Russia should deal with it at the time.
Yes, and I actually looked up Trotsky a few days ago, and he's a very interesting person, I think.
He is,
probably the most interesting of everyone involved in the revolution, and definitely represent those ways that the population could go, basically. I also think that Trotsky and Snowball, they thought what the movement stands for, like originally a little more, whereas especially Napoleon really uses the whole system also for his own good. And obviously that was also something that happened in reality. But with Snowball, it's also interesting that he chose the name Snowball, because snow and the color white is something that's always associated with innocence. And Trotsky wasn't an innocent person. I would never say that, because he also was responsible for, a lot of shady stuff. At least Snowball really always had the other animals in mind. That's the feeling I got. And he really wanted this movement to function and to grow, and didn't put himself first.
So with the Snowball thing, I'm wondering if you're right about the snow thing, almost like representing purity, like the pure essence of what communism means. And then I'm also wondering, is it supposed to be like a snowball effect that it's supposed to represent? Like, if we start this in one country and then it can go to the next country, and slowly, socialism can take over the world. I have that name for me is a little less obvious than Napoleon. And I'm not quite sure about that one.
Yeah, definitely. And I think he maybe did that on purpose.
Yeah.
Because you just start to associate things with the name, but it's not giving you this clear picture. And I think that Trotsky is actually a person like that to a lot of people. Like, that he was there, and you kind of know, most people probably know that he was exiled and then murdered and stuff like that, but we don't really know that much about him. And I think this name that isn't as clear as all of the others basically could contribute to that.
That's really smart.
It's definitely an interesting thought.
So Boxer, I think, is another character that is one of the more interesting ones, one of the more fleshed out ones, and also a character that you can easily say, this represents probably the working class, the salt of the earth kind of people who are the groundwork of Russia.
Yeah, definitely. And the people who work the hardest but don't get anything out of it, basically.
And it's interesting. I don't know if this is at all intentional, or I'm just looking at this with a modern lens. There's really no space for disability within the system on the farm. For example, the windmill work on Sundays is voluntary, but if you are absent, rations are halved. So you can choose to have a day off, but and as soon as Boxer is unable to perform, he's not in retirement or anything. They just kill him off for meat, which is interesting. Your value within the system is just about the amount of work that you can produce that's valuable to Napoleon.
Yes, I think that's very intentional. And you also see this change. I didn't mention it in the summary because it's just a very small point, but in the beginning they have some sort of retirement system, and they say every animal will work until they're
you're right.
A certain age, and then they get some area where they can just lie around and eat their food, basically. And then as soon as Snowball is expelled from the farm, all of that changes, and there is no retirement for any animal.
It's true. You're right about it. I forgot about that they had that provision in place, and then it's just another thing that they go back on. So the next thing I had in my notes was I looked up how behind Russia was on industrialization and how they lacked the type of, just labor. They didn't have labor available, and how that is kind of represented in the windmill of trying to build all this up again. And this kind of benefited them actually in World War II when the Germans were coming in, and they didn't get anywhere. They couldn't take over the country because the roads weren't paved, and you're just in dirt roads with your tanks, and it kind of helped them out in the end. But it's interesting. How do you catch up, and then what are the sacrifices that keep happening in the building of this windmill, which seems like an endless task, right? It keeps being destroyed or something happens to it, and it's almost like they keep trying to do it over and over again in the book.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, the whole windmill storyline, and also how big of a part Boxer plays in that. So that's what we said earlier about the working class being exploited and not getting anything out of it, because Boxer works really, really hard on this windmill, and when everyone else is going to sleep already, he works extra hours, and then he gets up 2 hours earlier in the morning to just carry all of those heavy stones to rebuild the windmill for the third time, and it never gets finished, so he never gets any kind of reward from that. And then in the end, he gets killed, just as a thank you for all of the work. So I think that's very frustrating to read, actually.
Oh, it's so sad when the animals are like running after the van. You're like, no.
Yeah, also, I love the character of Benjamin, the cynical donkey, because he's basically the only one who really noticed what's up, like all around. He really realized very early on that maybe not everything's great what happens here, but he just has this feeling that nothing will ever change, so he doesn't do anything about it. But then when Boxer is sent away and he sees that he's gonna be slaughtered on this car or whatever, he gets so mad at all of the other animals for being so ignorant. And I think that was a really, really powerful moment, because you would never expect him to have such an emotional outbreak, basically. And it really showed how much Boxer means to him.
Yeah, he's also in that moment seeing Boxer as an individual, which is another thing that makes it so powerful. Yeah. Like you've said, he's not just defined by how can he help the farm. He cares about him as a person. And it's interesting, the donkey, how I think is the defense mechanism. If you are an older generation, you've seen this all before and nobody is going to listen to you anyways. You just keep it all inside. You don't speak up. You don't try and change anything because there's nothing you could have done about it.
Yeah.
I loved the cat, but I was having such trouble trying to look up what the cat is representing. It just kind of slinks around.
Yeah, I don't know too. I think the cat and also the raven, Moses, they are really interesting because they just basically do what they want. And with Moses, it's more apparent what he stands for. I think he stands for the whole religious aspect, because he always talks about this, I think it's called Sugar Candy Mountain, if I remember correctly, which is basically heaven, I guess, and always talks about how everything's better there.
Yeah.
But the cat, I don't really know if the cat even represents anything. Maybe it's also just a nice little touch that he wanted to include, but I don't know.
Yeah, and the cat gets away with everything. Nobody cares. The cat is so sly. I found it endearing. You're right that maybe it was just thrown in there. I did also love Molly, the white mare, she just wants to wear ribbons in her hair and have a good time and not take things too seriously, and that's not an option in that kind of society for her. So she got out. I mean, she was the only one who got out. So good for her.
Yeah. I thought that was actually also a very interesting storyline, because it really shows that the system isn't good for everyone. I mean, also not good for anyone in the end, but Napoleon maybe. But you always have these idealistic beliefs, but you also have to sacrifice stuff for that. And she just didn't want to do that. And she just felt so comfortable with all of these man-made things, and she really enjoyed being taken care of by a farmer. And I think it's really, really sad to see that, because at first you think, yeah, okay, the farmer is also pretty irresponsible and great for the animals that they can do their own thing and everyone gets enough food at first. But it's really heartbreaking to see her struggle with that, and just noticing that even at first, when the system wasn't all terrible, there are some people suffering under it.
So I had the neighbors. So Mr. Frederick is Hitler, who I guess had a non-aggression pact in 1941 and then breaks that pact with Operation Barbarossa in that same year, I think. I had to look all this up. Again, I'm like on Wikipedia the whole time. Stalin or Napoleon, he keeps having this threat of the world invading if they don't get their act together, if they don't industrialize. So yeah, I thought the neighbors were interesting, and kind of in the end they're all the same. You know, even if you have really horrible people like Hitler, I think at the end they're all sitting around the table together.
Yeah, I think that as the ending is one of the most powerful things about this book, I think, because it really shows. So you said earlier that it's basically written like a fairy tale, and in fairy tales we always have the good and the bad. And obviously when you start reading this book, you're rooting for the animals, right? You're rooting for all of these characters that you get to know. And then in the end, you realize a big part of these animals really isn't good at all, and is just as bad as all of the others, maybe even worse. And there isn't this clear distinction between good and bad anymore. Or some of the characters that you might put in the category of good animals at first just really wander to the bad ones. And that's very, very powerful to see, because that's something that continuously happens in history, where a movement starts and you think it's all great, and you think the leaders of it are great, and then they turn out to do horrible things and not to be good at all.
Yeah, and the rewriting of the rules was one of my favorite parts of that. How they kept the groundwork the same. They never got really rid of any of the rules, but they just kept writing over them and adding to them. And, oh, you thought nobody can do this? Well, there's an exception to it now. Yeah. And it keeps kind of morphing and degenerating and turning into this really ugly thing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of propaganda happening. There's also, I don't think I've mentioned him, but Squealer. He's basically like Joseph Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister under Hitler. So he's doing all of that work. He's rewriting the commandments. He's doing all of the speeches for Napoleon, where he talks about, it's basically just fake news. If we look at it from a more modern perspective, he just spreads fake news. He says, "Oh, like this and that has increased to the better, and you're so lucky to live on this farm, because on all of the other farms it's so much worse, and you're getting more food than before." And all of that, it's just fake. But obviously they want the animals to believe that they are doing great and that they are living in a system that's beneficial for them, so that they don't start another rebellion. And that's a very, very powerful message about propaganda as well.
Yeah, and Squealer is the perfect name. It's one of those perfect choices. Yeah. And I just looked it up. The second in command and minister of propaganda, I'm not going to say this right, Vyacheslav Molotov under Stalin. Another thing I didn't know, but this is probably all very familiar to people who are Russian. Yeah, so Orwell wrote this novel in response to Stalinist attitudes, which I think is so interesting that he has trouble publishing this book because at the time they're allied with Russia against Germany. But then later on, this is another one. This reminded me so much of Dr. Zhivago, and I just listened to your episode on that too, because I know you have a lot to say about it, how they then use this, or the CIA used this to distribute in Russia later on. And then
that was really interesting about Dr. Zhivago, and really messed up.
Messed up, yeah. So you have this situation of, oh, no, we can't publish this because it's against our allies. And then as soon as that power dynamic shifts and it's now the United States no longer allied with Russia, then they turn around and they use these literary works as weapons and try to distribute them in Russia to cause dissent and people questioning things. And yeah, it's fascinating how literature is used politically in that way.
Yes, definitely. And I think Orwell is the perfect example for that, because also 1984 has so many very, very political messages, and packaging those messages in a story that's a lot more easy to read than just having all of his thoughts in some kind of manifesto or something like that. It makes it so much more accessible to an everyday person, I'd say. So, I mean, I'm quite interested in history, but also I'm not sure if I would just sit down and do a lot of research on the Russian Revolution just like that. But because I was reading Animal Farm and Dr. Zhivago, I had a general understanding from these books. And then I really wanted to learn more and more and more about it. And I think that's a great thing that literature can do, to just package some of the more heavy topics and give you some kind of framework to understand them better and to engage with them in an easier way, I guess.
Yeah, well said. I absolutely agree with that. Dr. Zhivago was another one of those books where I was constantly looking things up. And I'm actually going to quote you on this. I wrote down what you said on your podcast, because everything in that book is always there to serve the story and never there to explain true movements or history.
Yeah.
And so you have to kind of be in the know. Same with Animal Farm. You can read this and not understand anything about Russian history, and you would lose a huge part of the book if you didn't fully engage with it and have that, reading comprehension to dive deeper into it. It almost loses most of its meaning, I would say, without that.
Yes, but I actually watched a video today about Animal Farm where they said that at first, when it then finally was published, a lot of the bookstores put it in the children's book section.
What?
Which is unbelievable to me. But of course, if you have no clue and if you're just reading it like that, oh, it's a nice little fairy tale about some animals on a farm.
But still, it gets so violent towards the end.
Yeah, I think so too. Like, so many animals are killed. And I don't know, I wouldn't sell it to kids. But I thought that was very interesting, that they even thought of that and just ignored the whole political aspect of it and the whole violence aspect of it.
That is so funny. That's a fun little fact. And yeah, another thing I can't stop comparing this to Dr. Zhivago, because both of these authors are alive at around the same time. Like, even their deaths are around the same time. And something else that you said about the characters in that story is they try to do so much, but they don't succeed, because the overarching machinations and things going on in Russia are just too big, and there's too much momentum. And it kind of brings me back to, the donkey character in Animal Farm, how it's not something that you can really fight against within the story. It's just, politically, there's so much going on. Like, you're just trying to live your life and survive.
Yeah, that's true. And also because this whole, the whole Russian Revolution and communism in general, it's just the opposite of individualism, Like, you can't, as an individual, you can't really do anything in the system like that, because the whole system is designed to not look at the individuals, but look at the whole population. So I think it's really difficult if you as one person or one animal in this situation know anything or realize that this is bad. It's extremely dangerous to voice your thoughts and to form some kind of community that could start a rebellion against the system. And that's also something that happens in 1984, where the situation is slightly different, of course, but there you have this regime that just watches every step you take and every facial expression you make, basically. So it's really impossible to find another person that thinks like you, and to connect with that person and to organize meetings without being watched and then just vaporized, as they call it, in 1984. And I think that's also true for communism or for the Russian Revolution or the whole story of Animal Farm. It's just, as an individual, you can't really know who to trust, and you can't really do anything on your own. So it's really difficult to get rid of the whole situation.
And 1984, so this is my first George Orwell that I've read. I'm not familiar with any of the others. But 1984, I believe, also deals with the idea of thought crimes, right? Is
Yes.
that correct?
That's a big part, and that's something that's very terrifying about it, but also one of the most interesting things in literature, I think. So they watch you all of the time, and basically when, I don't know, your eye twitches or something, they can just arrest you for that, because they say you've probably thought something against the regime. Or there are also cases of people being arrested in their sleep because they've muttered something. And it's all about, even your dreams could betray you, you know, even if you are a very, very strong believer in the whole system, but then you dream about starting a rebellion and you talk in your sleep, you could be just vaporized, as I said before. You could be just arrested for that. And yeah, I think it's really scary. And also they create this language, which is very interesting to me because I study linguistics and I find language very fascinating. But they create this language that's designed to limit people's thought. So they are aware that people are thinking something against the regime because, you know, people always do. You can't please everyone. And obviously they are terrible, so they know that people think stuff against them, and they want to change that entirely, and so they design this language that should basically have a very, very limited vocabulary that doesn't even allow them to think anything against them, which I don't know if that would work or if people would just make up words for that, but also because the communication between people is so limited, I think that if that worked, it would be really dangerous. If you only knew that language, you don't know how to phrase anything against these people in power, which is so terrifying.
I did not know that about that book with the language thing, and now I really want to read it. Because that is fascinating. That is so smart. I think there is a certain kind of, what is that called? Sapir-Whorf effect to that, which is, I'm sure you're familiar with, which is the idea that if you don't have a word for something, it's not as conscious in your mind.
Yeah.
And I think that would happen. I've seen that happen in speaking languages myself that I wouldn't have thought of a concept, but now I'm learning another language that has a word for it, and suddenly it's present in my mind. So yeah, I really want to read that one.
Yeah, you should. You definitely should. I really love the book, and I think the language thing isn't that big of a part of it, but for me it was one of the most interesting ones. So it's just mentioned every now and then, but then when you start thinking about it, it's absolutely terrifying.
So I want to get into some of my criticisms or things that did not work for me in Animal Farm. I thought the animals were sometimes so stupid and gullible. Like they keep trying to learn how to read, but they can't quite handle it. They have no memory capabilities. They can't remember anything. And having these animals represent Russian peasants, I thought it was at times almost a little insulting because it kept trying to propose that, oh, these Russian people are just too stupid to comprehend what's happening, when really it's more like, well, they just didn't have a choice. And again, I thought that was so much more well done in Dr. Zhivago and all these philosophical aspects to the book where it's like, well, how do I deal with all these things changing in my country? On Wikipedia, there's a little snippet by George Sewell, who reviewed the book back when it came out. And he was really disappointed in the book. He said, the allegory turned out to be a creaking machine for saying in a clumsy way things that have been said better directly. It seems to me that the failure of this book arises from the fact that the satire deals not with something the author has experienced, but rather with stereotyped ideas about a country which he probably does not know very well. And I think I would have to agree with him on that. I think it does show at times that George Orwell, he's never been to Russia. He wasn't Russian. I think he lacks that kind of, like Feingefühl. What's the English word for that? That kind of subtlety to communicate really what's happening within the minds of the people, and I think at times it was too heavy-handed.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think you definitely noticed that he wrote this from an outsider's perspective, and he just knew about these things that were happening, but he didn't experience them, as you said, and obviously that changes your perspective a lot. And I get what you say about these animals that are always portrayed as dumb, basically, especially the sheep. Mm-hmm. And I think I know what he wanted to do with that, because I think he wanted to show that there are these people in these systems that just chant along and just don't question what it's all about, because I do think there are people like that don't think about whether this is a good development or not, but just join the movement because maybe also just because it's safest for them. Maybe that's also not a very conscious decision, but I think they are portrayed in a very, very one-dimensional way, which probably could have been more nuanced, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Nuance is a good word, because there are so many characters in here that have such depth, like Boxer. And then to kind of paint the rest of the Russian population in this very unflattering light, I thought was just a little unfair. You know, it's not that these people, they're part of this bigger wheel, this bigger system, and they're just, the normal person is just trying to get their crops in before the harvest. They don't even have, I want to say, the privilege to kind of deal with these bigger ideas, because they have so many other daily life things to worry about.
Yeah, definitely. I think he probably could have portrayed that, like I said, in a more nuanced way, with maybe focusing a little more on them and on their whys, basically. Like, why are they just doing all of that? Why are they just singing along, not questioning anything, not really caring to learn to read and to write? Why aren't they realizing how this education could benefit them? Like, what are their priorities and why is it like that? I think that would have given the whole thing a lot more depth, because I think there are definitely people like that in all of these systems, but mostly they just have their own reasons that we probably just don't understand. And I don't think anyone will just join a new movement without having any reason for that. I think it probably is also about safety a lot of the times. You don't want to be killed. You see other animals being killed because they talk to Snowball, for example. So you don't want to do that. You just want to live your life, want to have enough to eat. You want to, don't cause any trouble because you want to be safe. I think safety is a big thing with that didn't really come up. And I think that he could have included there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it is also worth noting that the time that he writes this in is in response to people not questioning any of this, because they are allies with Russia and they're like, oh, everything they're doing over there is probably fine. And he's, one of the people who's like, no, this isn't fine. We need to examine this, even if we are allies in war with them at the moment. We have probably a different perspective of it now, living in times of peace, but it's still a little controversial and interesting that he wrote this during the time that it was written in.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really important, and that's something that he really understood. I feel like also from having read 1984 as well, I think he really understood the importance of not just taking anything for what it is, but really questioning why things happen, how things are happening, who's responsible for that, and what are the benefits of that, and are there any benefits of that, and not just saying, oh, like we're friends with them. It's like saying, I don't know, this is my friend, and if she does anything terrible, I don't care at all because she's my friend. I think that feels wrong as well, right? If your friend turns out to be a murderer, you wouldn't just not care at all. And I think that's something that he really, really understood, and he really wanted to encourage people to think critically about everything around them.
Well said, well said. I don't really have any other notes on this. Anything else that you had that you wanted to go into deeper?
I think we've actually covered everything I wanted to talk about.
Perfect. So tell people about your podcast that I love to listen to, and where can people find you online?
My podcast is Buchstäblich Podcast. It's in German, so not all of you are going to be able to listen to it. But yeah, it's a podcast about literature and culture and basically everything that's interesting to me. And right now I haven't recorded for a while, but I'm working on bringing it back. So if you're interested, there will be more episodes on there soon. And yeah, I talked about 1984 and the language that they're creating and Dr. Zhivago on there. So if you want to go deeper on the things we talked about here, you can check that out. And yeah, the podcast is also on Instagram at Buchstäblich Podcast. And I also have another Instagram handle called My Colorful Bookshelf, which is basically my Bookstagram account where I post a lot of colorful books that I read. So yeah, that's where you can find me.
Yeah, and all your descriptions on that are bilingual, I believe.
Yeah,
on your Bookstagram account.
So, on my Bookstagram account, it's all English and German, so everyone can understand.
Your podcast does such great summaries of a book, which I find summaries so hard to do, and then you always ground it into why is this important today, and yeah, and also I think if you are learning German, I would definitely recommend the Buchstäblich podcast because you have a very very clear voice and enunciate words that I think are easy. It's easy to understand if you are learning German. I think it's a good resource.
Oh, thank you.
But yeah, thank you so much for being on. I'm so glad we made this happen.
Yeah, me too. I'm still very excited that we did that.
Great suggestion for a book. And that was the end of our episode for Animal Farm with Marie from the Buchstäblich podcast. Again, all her links are below in the description box, so you can listen to her beautiful Austrian accent and have her tell you all about the great classics that still are with us today. Again, you can find us at Modern Life Pod on Instagram and Twitter. We're also on YouTube, Modern Life Podcast, and you can also email us at modernlifepod@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.